The wind carried dust and ashes over the hollowed-out remnants of what was once a thriving world. Skyscrapers stood as silent tombstones, their broken windows like empty eyes staring at a sky forever gray. Roads were cracked, overrun by vines, rusted vehicles, and skeletons of a society that fell too fast to understand its end. Amid the ruins, a faint whisper carried through the wind, not a voice, but a feeling. A warning. A memory. In the heart of this dead world, a lone radio crackled inside a half-collapsed bunker. It sputtered static and fragments of a broadcast that hadn't changed in weeks. If you're still out there, if anyone's still out there, hold on. Help is coming. Marla blinked the sleep from her eyes, her rifle resting on her lap, her hands numb from the cold. The morning frost had crept into the shelter despite the insulation. She wrapped her coat tighter and glanced toward the metal door sealed shut with chains. It had been weeks since anyone had tried to break through it, human or undead. But safety was a lie in a world where the dead walked and the living were desperate. Across the room, a teenager named Eli stirred beneath a mound of blankets. He was barely 17, rail-thin, with dark circles under his eyes and a haunted look that never faded. He had stopped speaking much since they'd lost Jonah. Marla still remembered the moment clearly, Jonah screaming, firing into the horde, telling them to run. His blood had painted the stairwell by the time the door slammed shut. "We need to move soon," Marla said, her voice low. Eli didn't respond. He just stared at the ceiling as if he could see through it. There were only 3 of them left now. Marla, Eli, and Nora, the engineer who had kept the generator running and the lights on. But even Nora was beginning to give up. Supplies were running thin. Water was tainted. Every meal came with a prayer and a risk of infection. The whisper of movement snapped Marla's attention toward the door. Not footsteps, too soft. She raised her weapon and signaled to Eli to stay down. He didn't argue. He just vanished behind an overturned table, his fingers gripping a knife too big for his hand. A knock. Just one. Slow. Hollow. Like a test. Marla stood, approached the door with the caution of a predator stalking prey. "Who's there?" she asked, her voice sharp. Silence. Then, another knock. 2 this time. Quicker. Her heart raced. It was a pattern. 1 knock. Pause. 2 knocks. Pause. It was human. She hesitated, then yanked back a section of the door's peep slot. What she saw made her flinch. A man stood alone, his face hidden beneath a hood, eyes frantic. His mouth moved, but she couldn't hear through the layers of metal and rust. Behind him, there was no horde. No blood. Just the lifeless streets and the echo of wind. "He's alone," she said, stepping back. Eli emerged. Could be a trap. It always could be. Against instinct, Marla unchained the door, but only halfway. The man stepped inside carefully, holding his hands up. His clothes were torn, but his body seemed intact. "I've been walking for 2 days," he rasped. "I followed the signal, thought I was the only one left." Marla's eyes narrowed. "Name?" "Silas." "Bitten?" "No. Not even close. I don't go near them." Nora appeared from the shadows, her hands black with grease. "We need to be careful," she warned. "We bring in the wrong person, we die." "I get it," Silas said. "You have no reason to trust me. But I know things, about the cities. About survivors. I can help you get out of this hole." Marla studied him. He looked sincere. Or maybe he was just a better liar than most. But hope was a currency more valuable than bullets, and he was offering it freely. "We'll give you a day," she said. 1 day. You mess up, you're out." Silas nodded, grateful. He dropped his pack and leaned against the wall, exhausted. As night fell, the group sat in silence, eating a cold meal of canned beans in silence. But the silence was different now. It wasn't hopeless. It was tense. charged. Because Silas had whispered something before he slept. There's a safe zone. North. Past the broken highways and the swamps. A place where the infected can't go. Marla didn't believe in legends. But Eli looked up for the first time in days, eyes wide. And outside, in the broken city, something else was listening. Watching. Waiting. Let me know when you're ready for part 2. 4-0. You said. The fire crackled low in the metal barrel as the group huddled in silence. Above them, the world remained still, but too still. As if holding its breath. Marla watched Silas from across the room, her fingers never straying far from her rifle. He slept like someone used to danger, curled up with his pack clutched tightly against his chest. She didn't trust him. Not yet. But Eli was different. The boy had asked 3 questions about the safe zone before they even finished their dinner. Now, just before dawn, Nora moved quietly through the bunker, checking the generators' hum and sealing the vents. Her presence was constant, like the quiet heartbeat of the shelter. She didn't talk much, but she noticed everything. How far is this place? Marla finally asked. Silas stirred but didn't open his eyes. 5 days if we stay off the roads. 2 if we're desperate enough to cross the bridges. The bridges are overrun, Nora said flatly. Silas sat up, rubbing his face. They were. But the weather's changed things. They freeze now. Zombies don't do so well on ice. Eli perked up. So they, what, slip and fall? Silas gave a half-smile. Or they freeze in place. Either way, they're slower. Easier to get past. Marla folded her arms. You didn't mention this last night. I didn't know if I'd still be alive in the morning, he said. Didn't want to waste breath on maybes. The wind howled outside, pressing through cracks like fingers reaching for warmth. They all felt it, that creeping cold that wrapped itself around bones and hope alike. We can't stay here much longer, Nora finally admitted. Power's dying. The solar panels are shot, and the battery's not holding a charge. Silas looked between them. Then come with me. If there's even a chance this place is real, wouldn't you take it? Marla hesitated. Risk was the only thing they had in abundance. She looked at Eli, then Nora. They didn't nod, but they didn't argue. I'll scout first, Marla decided. If anything looks wrong. You'll be ready, Silas interrupted. I figured. They left the bunker at dawn, the door sealed behind them with a silent farewell. The streets were lined with abandoned lives, broken toys, photos clinging to crumbling walls, messages scrawled in blood or hope. We made it to Willow Ridge. Save the children. Burn the bitten. The world spoke in whispers, and not all of them were sane. Marla led the group through alleyways and sewer grates, avoiding the open roads. The infected had started nesting in strange places, abandoned churches, shattered malls, even playgrounds. Silas guided them around these danger zones with uncanny accuracy. How do you know so much? Eli asked once as they rested beside a burned-out library. I listen, Silas replied. Most people try to survive by fighting. I survived by paying attention. Later that evening, the group reached the edge of the city. What waited beyond was a long stretch of highway leading toward the mountains. The snow had already begun to fall. There's an old checkpoint ahead, Silas warned. If the military didn't burn it, it might still be crawling. Marla motioned for silence. They crept through the wreckage of the checkpoint like ghosts, past scorched Humvees and shattered barricades. But the real horror was what lay beyond. A pit. Dozens of bodies, frozen and twisted, lined the inside of a massive ditch dug into the snow-covered ground. Not all of them were dead. One twitched. Marla held up her fist. Movement, she whispered. The twitching corpse jerked violently, and a wet, rattling moan escaped its mouth. Others began to stir, slowly, agonizingly, pulled from frozen hibernation by the scent of the living. We have to go, Nora hissed. Eli couldn't stop staring. They're waking up. The pit erupted with movement as the undead began clawing their way out of the ice. Marla fired once, clean headshot, and the others followed. Silas dragged Eli back by the collar as the snow churned with decaying limbs and gnashing teeth. They ran. No longer careful. No longer quiet. The undead surged behind them like a wave of rot and hunger, their frozen limbs cracking as they moved. The group didn't stop until the trees swallowed them and the distant moans faded into wind. Breathing hard, Marla dropped to her knees in the snow. "We're not ready for this." Silas didn't speak. He just looked north. "None of us are," he finally said. "But if we don't move forward, we're already dead." And as the snow fell around them, soft and unrelenting, a new sound rose in the distance, one not made by the infected. A horn. A long, low signal echoing through the mountains. Someone, or something, was waiting ahead. The horn echoed again, a mournful sound that cut through the wind and snow like a cry for help, or perhaps a warning. Marla's instincts flared as she glanced toward the horizon, where the shadow of the mountains loomed. The cold had sunk deep into her bones, but the sound of that horn brought with it something far worse, uncertainty. "Did you hear that?" Eli asked, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. Marla nodded, eyes narrowing as she scanned their surroundings. They were deep in the woods now, the decaying remnants of civilization behind them, swallowed by the wilderness. Every step they took was on borrowed time. The undead were relentless. Now that they had been disturbed, they would be coming for them. It was only a matter of time. "What do you think it is?" Nora asked, her breath visible in the frigid air. "I don't know," Marla admitted, adjusting the strap of her rifle. "Could be a survivor group, but it could also be a trap." Silas remained silent, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. The horn sounded again, closer this time. It wasn't just a warning, it was a call. A deliberate signal. "We need to move," Silas finally said, his voice steady, though his gaze was distant. "If they're hostile, they'll be ready for us." Marla chewed on her lower lip, weighing their options. The dead were one thing, but living humans, they could be far more dangerous. She had seen too many survivors turn on each other in a world where every resource was precious, every breath a gift. "We'll go carefully," Marla decided, her voice cold but firm. "We approach at dusk. If it's a trap, we'll have the cover of night." They moved quickly through the woods, keeping to the shadows. The snow beneath their boots crunched, but the trees helped muffle their movements. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of something old, decay, death, but also something else. It was the faint smell of smoke. "There's something burning," Eli said, his voice barely above a whisper. Marla raised a hand to silence him. Her sharp eyes darted across the landscape. The trees opened up ahead, and they could see it now, a clearing with a small, makeshift campfire burning in the center. Around it stood silhouettes, too many to count. "Stay low," Marla whispered, signaling the others to crouch behind a thick cluster of trees. They moved silently, their breath coming in quiet puffs as they approached. From their vantage point, they could see the camp more clearly. A small group of survivors, maybe 10 or 15, gathered around the fire. They looked exhausted, ragged, but not entirely defeated. Some of them wore the scars of past battles, scratches, bruises, and dirty bandages, but none appeared infected. "They're human," Silas said quietly, his voice carrying a note of relief. "We've found them." "Are they dangerous?" Nora asked, her eyes still fixed on the group. "We'll find out," Marla replied, moving to the edge of the clearing. "Stay here. I'll go first." With the others watching from the shadows, Marla approached the fire cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the thick snow. As she neared the camp, the survivors seemed to take notice. A tall man with a worn military jacket stepped forward, his hand instinctively going to the rifle slung across his back. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice low but firm. Marla stopped a few paces away, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said, her voice steady. "We're just looking for shelter." The man eyed her warily for a moment before lowering his hand. "We've got enough problems of our own. But, you look like you've been through hell." "We've been walking for days," Marla said. "We heard the horn." "Is it true? Is there a safe place up north?" The man studied her for a long moment, then looked over his shoulder at the campfire. His face softened, just slightly. "There's a place. We're part of a larger group, but," he trailed off, his voice faltering. "It's not what we hoped it would be. If you're looking for safety, I won't lie to you. It's a long road, and it's not without risk." Marla felt the weight of his words settle like a stone in her stomach. She had hoped for more, for something solid to cling to, but instead, she was met with more uncertainty. "What do you mean?" she asked, stepping closer. "What's waiting for us up there?" The man hesitated, glancing back at his camp before lowering his voice. "The infected, they're not the worst thing out there. There's another group, a cult, if you can call them that. They believe the end of the world is a new beginning. They'll do anything to survive." Marla's heart skipped a beat. "A cult? They raid us. Steal food. Take people. They think the rest of us are tainted, unclean. We've had our own problems, but that's the worst of it." The fire crackled between them as Marla processed the information. The world had already been torn apart by the infected, but now there was something worse. A new breed of human savagery, born out of desperation. She turned and motioned for the others to join her. As they approached the campfire, the tension in the air grew thicker. There was safety here, but not the kind that came with peace. And as the sun dipped behind the mountains, the reality of their situation became all too clear. They were no longer just running from the dead. They were running from something far more dangerous. "Let me know when you're ready for part 4. The fire flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the snow. Marla sat with her back against a fallen log, her eyes never straying far from the group of survivors now surrounding the fire. The man who had spoken to her, Derek, was silent, his face weary but hard as stone. He seemed to know more than he let on, but Marla wasn't ready to trust him completely. Not yet. The rest of the group was tense, their eyes darting nervously to the edges of the clearing. The wind carried the faint scent of burning wood, but it also brought with it something darker, the faint, sickly scent of decay. The air itself felt charged, as if the world were holding its breath. Silas, who had joined her at the fire, leaned in closer, his voice a low whisper. "This doesn't feel right, Marla." "A cult? Out here?" "I've heard of them," she replied softly. "There's always someone. Always something worse than the dead." Nora sat beside them, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming mug of water. "It's one thing to fight for survival, but to believe you're somehow above everyone else?" She shook her head. "That's dangerous." Marla nodded, her gaze flickering to the dark shapes of the survivors in the camp. "It's like the infected. You never know when it'll spread, when it'll take hold of someone." The wind shifted again, and Derek's eyes narrowed as he scanned the tree line. "If you're going north," he said, his voice low and strained, "you'll need to be prepared. The cult's followers, they call themselves the Purified, they don't leave survivors. At least, not in the way you'd hope. If you go up there, you're walking into their territory. You might never come back." Marla felt a chill creep up her spine, but she didn't flinch. "What do you mean, not in the way we'd hope?" Derek looked toward the fire, his expression haunted. "They take people, Marla. It's not just food they're after. They take anyone they deem impure, or unclean." They do what?" Nora interrupted, her voice rising. "You mean they kill them," Derek finished, his voice barely a whisper. "And then they use them." The group fell silent. The flames crackled, but the warmth it offered seemed far away. "What do you mean, use them?" Eli asked, his voice thin with disbelief. Derek shifted uncomfortably, as if the words themselves burned him. He stopped, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "They sacrifice them. It's part of their twisted belief. They think the more people they purge, the closer they get to some sort of salvation. Marla felt the weight of his words sink in. She had heard stories of people who had turned religion into a weapon, using it to justify the worst atrocities. But this was something else. She could see it in Derek's face. He was speaking from experience. Are they all like that? Marla asked, her voice steady despite the fury brewing inside her. Derek didn't meet her eyes. No. Some of them are just afraid. They're lost, and they follow because they think it's their only chance. But the leaders? They're true believers. They'll stop at nothing. Marla looked over at Silas. You know about this, don't you? He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. I've heard rumors. But rumors aren't the same as truth. The wind howled again, and for a moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Marla felt the weight of what lay ahead press down on her. They could keep moving forward, ignoring the danger, just like they had been doing for days, for months. Or they could turn back, find another route, and hope they wouldn't encounter the purified along the way. But there was no turning back. Not now. If we're going to make it to the safe zone, we have no choice, Marla said, her voice firm. We need to get through the mountains. We need to keep moving. Derek's eyes hardened. It's not that simple. If they find you, if they catch you, they'll come after you. They'll follow you. And they're good at it. They don't make mistakes. Then we won't make any, Marla replied, her determination flaring. We can handle it. We've come this far. Nora stood up, brushing snow from her legs. We don't have much time before nightfall. We should move while we still have the light. Silas stood as well, grabbing his pack. I agree. The longer we stay here, the more exposed we become. Marla looked over at Eli, who was staring into the fire, his expression distant. She could see the fear in his eyes, but also something else. Hope. The slightest spark. And for the first time in what felt like forever, it gave her a sense of clarity. We move at first light tomorrow, Marla declared, standing up to face the group. We stick together, no one gets left behind. And if the purified come after us, we fight. The group nodded, a grim understanding passing between them. They were no longer just running from the dead. They were running from something far worse. As the fire burned low, Marla lay down beneath the stars, her thoughts heavy with the weight of what was to come. The mountains were still a long way off, and the road ahead was uncertain. But one thing was clear, they were no longer just surviving. They were fighting for something more. And no matter the cost, they wouldn't let it slip away. Let me know when you're ready for part 5. The morning light barely pierced through the overcast sky as Marla and the others gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the camp. The wind had picked up overnight, sending flurries of snow swirling through the trees and across the barren landscape. They were heading north, toward the mountains, hoping to find the elusive safe zone Derek had mentioned. But with every step, the threat of the purified loomed closer. Derek had been silent since their conversation the night before, his eyes clouded with the kind of knowledge that only comes from surviving the worst kind of human cruelty. He had warned them, but his warnings were almost too much to bear. Marla knew the world had changed, but she hadn't truly realized how twisted the human heart could become until now. Let's move out, Marla said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. The cold was numbing, but the fear was worse. Every footstep felt like it could be their last. They trekked through the forest in silence, the only sounds the crunching of snow beneath their boots and the occasional call of a distant bird. The trail ahead was difficult, the path winding through dense trees and steep inclines. The mountains were not forgiving, and they were all acutely aware of how exposed they were. Nora walked beside Marla, her breath coming out in visible clouds. Do you think they're really that dangerous? She asked in a low voice. The purified? Marla glanced over at her, her eyes shadowed by the weight of their journey. I don't know. But I've seen enough to know that people like them don't stop until they get what they want. What if we can't outrun them? Nora's voice wavered, but her eyes were resolute. We won't outrun them if we don't stay sharp, Marla replied, her gaze scanning the horizon. The mountains loomed larger now, their jagged peaks visible even through the thickening snow. We fight if we have to. But we keep our distance. The others followed closely behind, their eyes constantly flicking to the edges of the trees, as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. But there was nothing. Just the silence of the wilderness. For now, that was a blessing. After several hours of trekking, they reached a narrow pass that led deeper into the mountains. The wind howled through the rocks, and the temperature seemed to drop even further, as if the mountain itself was trying to push them back. The path ahead was treacherous, a series of loose stones and ice-covered rocks that could easily send a person tumbling to their death. "We'll need to move carefully," Silas said, his voice low but firm. "One wrong step, and we'll be stuck here. We need to keep our footing." Marla nodded, her eyes flicking over the path ahead. She had climbed mountains before, but that was before the world had fallen apart. Now, each step felt like it carried the weight of their survival. Derek was already ahead, his eyes scanning the pass with a wariness that made Marla uneasy. He had said little since they had set off, but there was a tension in his posture, a tightness that suggested he was waiting for something to happen. She could almost feel his anxiety growing as they moved deeper into the mountains. As they reached a particularly narrow ledge, Marla heard a faint noise from below, a scraping sound, like something dragging across the rocks. She held up her hand, signaling for everyone to stop. The others froze, their eyes wide with fear. The noise grew louder, and soon, they could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the rocks, echoing out from the valley below. "Stay quiet," Marla whispered, her heart pounding. "We don't know who or what it is." They crouched low, the cold seeping into their bones as they pressed against the rocky outcropping. Marla's fingers gripped her rifle, her eyes straining to see through the falling snow. The sound grew closer, then stopped abruptly. A shadow moved across the pass, low and quick, like a wraith. Marla's breath caught in her throat as the figure paused at the edge of the trail, its silhouette barely visible against the gray sky. She held her breath, waiting for the figure to move again, but it didn't. A voice, low and guttural, called out from below. "Is anyone there?" Marla's pulse quickened. The voice was rough, ragged, too harsh to belong to a normal person. She could hear the desperation in it, the edge of madness. Derek's eyes widened, and he motioned for them to retreat further into the rocks. "The Purified," he muttered under his breath. "They found us." Marla's mind raced. She didn't know how far behind the cult was, but this wasn't the time for a fight. Not yet. They couldn't afford to waste energy on a battle they weren't prepared for. "Stay low," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We wait for them to pass." But the figure didn't move. It lingered in the pass, as if waiting for something. Marla could feel her anxiety rising with every passing second. Then, suddenly, the shadow moved again, this time, toward them. "They know we're here," Silas said, his voice tight with panic. Marla gritted her teeth, her mind racing. They were trapped. The narrow pass left them no room to maneuver, no room to run. "Get ready," she whispered, her hand tightening on her rifle. "If they come for us, we'll have no choice but to fight." But as the figure crept closer, Marla's heart sank. Another shape emerged from the shadows. Then another. And another. They weren't alone in these mountains. And worse, it seemed that the Purified had been waiting for them. The figures in the pass were closing in, their footsteps growing louder with each passing second. Marla's grip on her rifle tightened, her heart pounding in her chest. The cold wind stung her face, but it was nothing compared to the fear that was rising inside her. She had been prepared for the infected, for nature's dangers, even for hunger. But this was something different. The Purified were real. Marla's eyes scanned the group as they huddled behind the rocks, their breath shallow, their bodies tense. Silas was clutching a makeshift knife in his hand, his knuckles white. Nora's fingers were trembling around her rifle. Only Derek seemed composed, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his unease. "They're getting closer," Silas whispered, his voice shaking. What do we do? Marla didn't answer immediately. The figures in the past were too close, too many. She could see their silhouettes now, some tall, some hunched over, and there was something unsettling about their movements. They were too quiet, too deliberate. And though they moved like humans, there was something about them that felt wrong. Something broken. Derek stepped forward slightly, his voice a harsh whisper. The purified don't kill from a distance. They want to see their victims up close. They want to purify them. If we can stay hidden for now, we might have a chance. Marla nodded, her mind racing. She could feel the air thickening with danger, but there was no turning back. They had to keep moving forward. The purified would never leave them alone once they had found them. But then, a voice, sharp and full of conviction, echoed through the mountains. Come out, survivors, it called, low and reverberating. You cannot hide from the cleansing. Marla's blood ran cold. The voice was clear, powerful, a leader's voice. And it sent a chill through her that made every muscle in her body tense. She exchanged a glance with Derek, whose face had gone pale. He knew the voice. He recognized the leader. It's Solomon, Derek muttered. He's their leader. He's the one who... Before he could finish, the leader's voice boomed again, cutting through the mountain air. We know you are here. Come out, and you shall be spared the trials. The purified shall be saved. The impure will be consumed. The words echoed ominously, bouncing off the surrounding cliffs. Marla's mind raced. There was no choice now. They had to either run or face the cult head-on. Either way, their chances of survival were dwindling. We can't stay here, Silas said, his voice growing more desperate. If we move, we might be able to outrun them. Marla considered his words, her eyes narrowing as she calculated their options. The pass ahead was too narrow to escape quickly. But there were rocks to the left, and if they could find a way to scramble up them. It's our only shot, she decided, her voice firm. We move fast, and we don't stop. Follow me. Without waiting for a response, she signaled to the group to follow her. They scrambled up the rocks, their boots slipping on the icy surface. The snow had started to fall heavier, and the wind howled through the jagged peaks, making it harder to hear anything other than the shriek of the storm. But just as they reached the top, a shout rang out from below. They're moving. Don't let them escape. The voice of Solomon again, louder, more frantic. And then the unmistakable sound of feet scrambling over the rocks followed by the steady hum of chanting. The purified had begun their pursuit. Marla's heart hammered in her chest as she urged the others to climb faster. The rocks were slippery, but they had no choice. Their only hope was to gain the high ground, to outrun the cult long enough to lose them in the maze of cliffs and valleys. They made it to the top, breathless and exhausted. Marla glanced back down at the clearing below, where the figures of the purified were beginning to scale the rocks, their faces hidden in the shadow of their hoods. She could see their pale, gaunt faces now, their eyes burning with feverish intensity. They were relentless. We need to go, Nora gasped, her face pale from the climb. How much farther? Marla didn't answer immediately. She was already moving ahead, her eyes scanning the terrain. The mountains seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, but they had to keep going. If they stopped, if they faltered, it would be over. There's a cave ahead, she said, pointing to a narrow opening in the rock face 100 yards away. We can shelter there for a moment, catch our breath. The others didn't need any convincing. They followed her without question, their feet pounding on the icy ground, moving with the urgency of animals fleeing a predator. But as they neared the cave, the ground beneath them shifted. The rocks groaned, and before Marla could react, the earth beneath their feet gave way. She barely had time to grab hold of a jagged rock as the others tumbled down the slope. Silas screamed as he lost his footing, and Marla's heart stopped as she watched him fall, his body disappearing from sight. No! Nora shouted, reaching for him, but Marla grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the edge. Stay back! Marla shouted. We can't afford to lose anyone. They couldn't afford to stop now. Silas was gone, but there was no time to mourn. The Purified were still on their tail, and the journey ahead was only going to get harder. "Keep moving," Marla urged, her voice firm. "We can't let them catch us." As the sound of pursuit grew louder, Marla felt the weight of their situation sink in. They weren't just running from the infected anymore. They were running from something far worse. The only question now was, would they make it out alive? The screech of rocks tumbling down the mountain echoed in Marla's ears as she pulled Nora away from the edge. For a heartbeat, she feared they might be too late. Silas was gone, swallowed by the crumbling earth below. The others had managed to stay on solid ground, but Marla could see the fear in their eyes. Silas's fall had shaken them all. Their small group had just gotten smaller. But there was no time to dwell on it. The Purified were closing in, their guttural chants growing louder with each passing second. The group had barely caught their breath when they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind them, skittering across the rocks, the weight of the Purified pressing down on them. "We need to keep moving," Derek said, his voice barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of their survival. His eyes, dark with determination, scanned the horizon. "We can't let them catch us now." Marla's heart raced, the pressure of the situation pressing against her chest. She turned toward the cave she had spotted earlier, a narrow opening in the side of the mountain, barely visible in the swirling snowstorm. It was their only hope, and they had to reach it before the colt did. The climb down was treacherous, every step a battle against the snow and ice. They moved in a tense, single-file line, the weight of their packs slowing them down. But Marla didn't stop. They couldn't afford to. Every moment felt like it could be their last. The entrance to the cave finally came into view, a jagged scar in the rock face. Marla urged them on, but as she reached the opening, something caught her attention. A low rumble, like thunder, vibrated through the ground. The air seemed to shift as the cave's entrance darkened, shadows crawling along the walls. Marla felt a cold dread creep up her spine. "We have to go in now," she snapped, her voice sharp with urgency. "Quickly!" They scrambled into the cave, the cold wind biting at their backs. The shelter of the cave was a small mercy, a fleeting moment of safety. But Marla knew it wouldn't last long. Once inside, they stopped to catch their breath, the tension still thick in the air. Marla scanned the dimly lit cavern, the walls damp and slick with age. It wasn't much, just a narrow passage that led deeper into the mountain. But it was better than being out in the open. For now, it would have to do. The others collapsed onto the cold stone floor, gasping for air, their breaths visible in the frigid air. Marla's heart still thudded loudly in her chest, but she forced herself to focus. She had to think. "Nora, Silas's," her voice cracked as she tried to speak, but the words didn't come. What was there to say? They had lost someone important, someone who had been with them since the beginning. Marla fought back the sting of tears. They had to keep going. Silas's memory couldn't be their anchor, it couldn't pull them under. Derek stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on Marla's shoulder. "We can mourn later. We have to keep moving. We still don't know what else is out there." Marla nodded, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "You're right. We can't stop now." The group sat in tense silence for several moments, trying to gather their bearings. The cave was cold, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. But as they listened closely, they could hear the distant sounds of the storm outside, the howling wind and the crunch of snow beneath the boots of their pursuers. The Purified were still hunting them. "We can't stay here," Derek said finally, breaking the silence. "It's too exposed. They'll find us soon enough." Marla's mind raced. They had no idea how long they could stay hidden in the cave. The longer they stayed, the higher the risk of being discovered. The Purified wouldn't stop until they had wiped out every last survivor. They needed to move again, but where? "There's another passage deeper in the cave," Derek said, his eyes flicking toward the dark recesses of the cave. "It leads farther down. We may be able to lose them if we go underground." Marla hesitated, her mind conflicted. Going deeper into the mountain could be their only chance, but the thought of venturing into the unknown made her uneasy. The last thing they needed was to get lost in the dark. But the sounds of the purified closing in outside left no other option. "Lead the way," Marla said, her voice tight but resolute. They moved quickly, cautiously, down the narrow passage Derek had pointed out. The tunnel twisted and turned, the walls narrowing in places until they were forced to crawl through tight openings. The deeper they went, the colder it became, and the air grew heavier, almost oppressive. Every step felt like a descent into madness. The eerie quiet of the cave was punctuated only by the sound of their labored breathing and the occasional scraping of boots against rock. Marla's senses were heightened, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She could feel something watching them. And then, the unmistakable sound of a voice, low and guttural, floated through the darkness. "We are coming for you." Marla froze, her breath catching in her throat. They had been found. "Let me know when you're ready for part 8. The chilling words echoed through the darkness of the cave, freezing Marla's blood. She hadn't expected it to end like this, not in the suffocating silence of the underground, with the echoes of the Purified's relentless pursuit growing louder. They had been running for so long, hoping for a break, a moment to breathe, but the moment had never come. Now, there was no escaping. Marla's breath hitched as the voice echoed again, clearer this time, "We are coming for you." The others froze, their eyes wide with fear. Derek was the first to react, his face pale, his hand tightening around the handle of his rifle. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He knew, like Marla did, that they had no more time to run. The Purified had cornered them in the depths of the earth. "They know we're here," Nora whispered, her voice trembling. "We're trapped." Marla felt the weight of those words like a physical blow. Trapped. For all their planning, for all their effort to outrun the cult, they had come to the end. The narrow passage they had followed into the cave now seemed like a maze with no way out, the walls pressing in, the air growing colder with each passing second. "We can't let them take us," Derek said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "We fight. We die fighting." The group nodded, but even as they steeled themselves for a final stand, they knew the odds were against them. The Purified had never been defeated. They were relentless, fanatical, their faith driving them beyond the limits of human endurance. And they were closing in, one step at a time. Marla felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. They weren't supposed to be the last ones, hiding in the dark, waiting for the inevitable. There had to be more. There had to be a way to survive. A sudden sound interrupted her thoughts, a low rumble, coming from deep within the earth. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and a faint light flickered in the distance. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a trick of the eye, but then the rumble grew louder, stronger. "Earthquake?" Nora asked, her voice trembling with fear. Marla shook her head. "No, something's happening. Something's coming." Derek looked toward the flickering light, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. "Is that?" Before he could finish, the ground shifted again, this time with a violent jolt. The walls of the cave cracked, stones falling around them. Marla ducked instinctively, her hands shielding her face from the falling debris. The others scrambled for cover as the light grew brighter, casting strange shadows on the cave walls. "What in the world?" Silas's voice, weak but familiar, rang through the cave. Marla's heart skipped a beat. Silas. He couldn't be alive. But there he was, standing in the opening to the cave, his body covered in dust, his face bloodied but alive. The others gasped, their eyes wide in disbelief. I fell," Silas muttered, his voice raspy. "But something's happening outside. You need to come. Now." Marla was speechless for a moment, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Silas had fallen, had been lost to them, how was he here? "I thought you were gone," Derek said, his voice hoarse. Silas looked around, his eyes wild with confusion and fear. "I thought so too. But I found a way. There's something in the mountains." I think it's our only chance. The rumbling continued, louder now, as though the very earth itself was protesting. Marla's heart raced. She didn't have time to question how Silas had survived. She didn't care. All she cared about was the chance to escape. The Purified were still closing in, their chants growing louder. "We have to move, now," Marla said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Lead the way, Silas." Without waiting for a response, she grabbed Nora's arm and pulled her forward. Silas hurried ahead, guiding them through a narrow, hidden path that wound deeper into the cave. The light ahead grew brighter, the strange rumble growing louder, more insistent. As they pressed forward, the cave seemed to open up before them, revealing a vast underground cavern. It was unlike anything Marla had ever seen, glowing crystals embedded in the walls, casting an ethereal light across the stone floor. The air here felt different, lighter, almost alive. "Where are we?" Derek whispered, his eyes wide with awe. Silas paused, his gaze fixed on the cavern. "This is it," he said softly. "The place I found when I fell. It's not just a cave. There's something here, something the Purified want. And they'll stop at nothing to get it." Marla stepped forward, her mind racing. The Purified were relentless, but now, it seemed, they had a new mystery to solve. This cavern could be their last hope, or their final tomb. The rumble grew louder, and Marla knew that time was running out. They were almost out of time. Then, from the darkness, the first figure of the Purified appeared. A leader, Solomon, his eyes glowing with zeal. The chanting had ceased. It was now down to a deadly silence. Marla felt her body tense, ready for the fight. They had come so far. They couldn't let this be the end. She took a step forward, her rifle aimed at the figure, her heart steady in the face of the coming storm. "This is where it ends," she whispered, steeling herself for the battle that would decide everything. End of the story.